Hello again, on to the next video. Now this video will be about basically the polar opposite of natural rights, human rights. Now you might hear them especially when talking about things like the UN and other international organizations. When people talk about rights, this is usually what they mean. Now human rights include a lot of things. This one it's far easier to write down because they are rights that we have in a society, and thus anything that comes from a society that we deem to be a right is something that falls in this category. For example, the right to education, healthcare, food, water, housing, privacy, and cleanliness. Now you might also hear stuff like vacationing or living wages. All these would fall under human rights. Now, it's important to note cleanliness, I more just made up because I was thinking on the fly, but all the other ones, one can make a very real argument that people will claim as human rights. It's also important to note equality is not a human right, mostly because it doesn't exist. Same with gender parity. But all of these rely on an understanding of the state and society being able to provide such things to their people. Now, this is also something that originates from the Enlightenment. For example, one big thing was the idea of conversion. So, particularly with Locke's ideas, the idea was, in a state of nature, there are the wise and there are the brutes. And the wise must, through a social contract, work together to ensure they do not get harmed by the brutes, and thus their natural rights are turned into human rights via the social contract, which are protected by the organization which rules the group, also known as the state. I may get that slightly wrong, but that is the general gist of it. And so it's often viewed that human rights are just an extension of natural rights, just with society. It's a small issue. It's not. Now, privacy is one of the interesting ones that could be argued to be a natural right due to the simple fact that when you're on your own, you technically have privacy. The issue is, there's no one to invade it either, so it functions more as a human right. Voting is also another one, which I didn't include here, because suffrage, number one, it's only applicable in certain societies. For example, an absolute monarchy can provide all of this, every single one of them. It could pay its people well itself, allow them free vacation time, clean the streets, protect their privacy, give them free housing, water, food, healthcare, and education. That doesn't mean that it doesn't provide human rights just because it doesn't have suffrage. Now, a liberal might argue it's a right. I'd say it's not. It's just a way of governing. And the difference between governing and rights is very important. For example, how the country is ruled matters less than what it does. For example, you could have a republic where every single person, even at the age of 5, is allowed to vote. So from 5 to death, you are allowed to vote in this society. Everyone's free to vote, but if the government censors what you're allowed to say, doesn't provide education, takes away your right to bear arms, takes away your right to food, takes away your right to cleanliness, make sure you get paid dirt poor wages, and every other authoritarian or totalitarian trick up the book, then it's not a good place to live and should not be considered a good place. Voting rights should never be a measure of how good a society is or how many rights it protects. Because you can give totalitarians voting rights, and that does not mean they enact human rights just because they have the ballot. The ballot is entirely separate. It's important to separate political, social, and economic. Right here. Because while they feed into each other, for example, we generally see republics be far, how should I put this, far more interested in human rights and liberalization. Now, it's not a one-to-one thing. For example, Hungary and Turkey are very much republics with the ability to vote, with all of that. They are also some of the most illiberal places on the planet. I am also not a liberal, and I support suffrage. Russia used to be a republic, and they voted in Putin. Illiberal democracy, or illiberal republics, however you want to call them, they exist, and they do not protect these things often. Maybe education, maybe healthcare. On occasion, you may see housing, and very rarely you'll see wages, but pretty much these things are not protected under an illiberal system, because these are liberal and socialist concepts. Fascists, too, actually care about this. For example, the Nazis made sure to provide public health care, education, wages, and vacations for their citizens, and by citizens I mean Germans. Let's not get it twisted here. They did not care if you were not a German. In fact, they made sure your rights were taken away and waived completely if you weren't. But for the German people, most of these were absolutely guaranteed by the Nazi state. Even the Nazis allowed their people to have some of these rights. As a matter of fact, they allowed them to have most of them, except privacy. Because the Nazis were not exactly fans of privacy. Gestapo much. But, back to the main point. These are all ideas centered on liberalism and the Enlightenment in particular, coming from it. Here's the small issue. Their privileges. Now one may say, why are they privileges and not rights? Well, simple. They can only exist with human action. That also means they either exist through theft or through a person choosing to provide it. For example, how do you guarantee every person has food if you promise it as a right? Well, you either force farmers to hand it over, or you pressure the farmers into doing so willingly. Because it's worth noting, not every farmer is going to want to sell their food dirt cheap. As a matter of fact, there was a whole issue during the Depression where farmers were selling their food for too cheap, so the government, through subsidies and other methods, tried to increase prices of food so farmers could actually, live on a steady income. That's what the Agricultural Adjustment Act tried to do. Now, there's also the same thing with housing. If someone has housing and they want to make it available to everyone, how do they do so? Again, either force them or coerce. Public housing is taken from others, because that area is almost certainly being used for something before, and the state's going in and saying, oh yeah, we'd like to rezone this and use this area to do this, this, and this. Mainly with public housing. Same with good wages. You are not giving the option to pay good wages, you are saying you do this or else. Education, same thing. Now, there are plenty of people, especially in healthcare and education, that I'll gladly admit are willing to help people. That's why they get into the job. However, when you make it a right, you inherently say it must be provided. And so often, the state will either bribe or, if it comes to a strike, force teachers and others to essentially keep working or else. Because it's deemed essential. And if it's a right, there can be no negotiation because, well, if it's a right, it must be provided. If someone has cancer, you cannot wait for healthcare to stop striking so the doctors get back to their positions and the nurses help them take care of patients. If it's a right, they gotta. That person who wants to get cancer treatment needs to get the treatment, no matter what. And so the government will likely force. It will use force to get them to do it. We saw this with Biden and the railroad strike. A service deemed essential for the economy and for the people was forcefully put back to work. That wasn't even a right. Something that was deemed essential but not a right was enough to get the government to start using union-breaking tactics. What do you think they're going to do when it's considered so important that it is a right to them? they will use strike breaking. They will crush any attempt to get better conditions. And it'll likely result in a lot of burnout, if not force. As a matter of fact, you could argue it would require slave labor, because if the wages aren't competitive enough and the people are tired enough, because remember, people still gotta eat, then in such circumstances, the person will effectively be forced against their will to work for little to no compensation. Slavery. Their bodies effectively aren't owned by them. And if you can't own yourself and decide, hey, I'd like to stay being a teacher, or I'd like to stay being a doctor, well, not exactly the best. Now, a lot of people still support human rights because they sound good. They sound good in theory. I'll be frank, do not. Because I do not believe that we should violate natural rights. Because human rights often violate natural rights. For example, the right to health care. Let's use an easy one. If you do not want to give up your medicine to a patient, as rude as that may be, that is a thing you would be allowed to do in a natural rights system, because that medicine is your property, and so you can decide who to give it to. Furthermore, it is part of your ownership of yourself to decide what you do with yourself. However, if the right to healthcare comes into play, guess what? You don't have a choice. You gotta give them something. And so you gotta give them the medicine. If they pay for it, well, that's one thing. If they don't and you're just required to fork it over, no, that's effectively theft. Because it's a forced transaction. I wouldn't exactly say that someone being forced to hand over money to a robber is a very non-theft situation, would you? Because I certainly wouldn't. Apologies if my wording is poor, but it's important to note these things because that's the reality of it. When you promise someone food, when you promise them housing, healthcare, education, water, if you say you must be given these things, you must receive them, then theft often, if not always, becomes necessary to deliver it. How do you make sure people in Rome get food with a grain dole? Well, you take food from Egyptian farmers and redistribute it to the Romans. How do you make sure the poor get good wages? Well, you put a gun to the head of every corporation and say, pay them well or else. And if they're caught not doing so, you arrest them and punish them. Except when they're illegal immigrants, because apparently that's necessary to keep food prices low, is letting people be paid under minimum wage. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. But hey, who am I to stop great leaps in logic like that? I mean, it's only coming from the people who used to use slavery and sharecropping. Yeah, fun times there. But let's go back and reconsider something. How would you, if you wanted to ensure people had access to these things, do it without human rights? Well, purely voluntary methods are one. There's also charities. Charities are far more effective at providing these essentials than a government-mandated human rights program. Because you're not saying it's alright, but a charity can say, it's basically essential, so we're going to provide it for you as a way to help you. And because charities are far more discerning and have been shown to spend their money far more wisely than a government, it would result in a lot of money saved. Now, there are plenty of arguments for and against certain things in relation to this. I won't get into all of them. I'll only go into the ones I already went into and summarize with this fifth and final point. Human rights are bad. And I don't mean in the sense that human rights must be completely ignored and that there's no merit to them at all. No, there is merit. The issue is the sacrifice is natural rights and freedom. If you are allowed to force a teacher to stay working, regardless of pay, regardless of any wish on their part, then you can and will effectively have complete control over them. You can do the same with a doctor. That's bad. A farmer. An owner of property. or an employer. It's the idea that I like, the base idea of people should have education, people should have healthcare, food, water, housing. I agree with all that. People should have that. The issue comes from how you achieve that. If you make it a government mandate, the government's going to enforce it using, well, force. That's how the government does things. Do you think the IRS collects taxes by saying, hey, how you doing, buddy? Please pay your taxes. We're not going to hurt you if you don't, but please do. Or do you think they say, all right, pay your taxes, and if you don't, we will investigate you, and we will arrest you if you do not. If you try to resist, we will beat you up. Yeah, they're definitely doing the latter, and they already have plans for how to do it in a nuke, so don't think they're not willing to go to extreme lengths to get their taxes. They want their share of your money. The government exists through force. It maintains itself through force. All these human rights are guaranteed through force, through offensive use of it, the threat of it. They are not defensive. They are not passive. They are blatant aggression, used to ensure that these things exist and are, well, put into law, and are felt as rights for people. In effect, the very notion of a human right is a lie. They're only natural rights. There can be only negative liberty. Only the things we innately have. Because to declare someone owes someone something, rather than saying you own certain rights that you have inherently, you are effectively saying, I can take from you to give to him because it is right. That is not moral, nor is it something that can hold up, because someone's rights are being violated in that process. You may say, oh, well, it's state diktat, so suddenly it's better. No. If the police seized your car because you had too many and then gave it to someone else because there's now a right to cars, that wouldn't exactly be something you would call moral now, is it? And if the state used the justification of the right to cars to take more than what they promised and sell the remainder, you wouldn't exactly call that a good thing either, would you? No, you wouldn't. But the state, in its actions to enforce these rights, does a lot of failures like it. Alright, we want education, so how do we ensure it's alright? Oh, well, we stash public schools, and then, siphon a bit off the top to fund people that we like, all the while promising that it'll totally be good. Totally. Absolutely. Yeah, it doesn't, and it doesn't work that well. As a matter of fact, as someone who came from that education, even going to a really good school, there are still several problems with it. I mean, I respect my teachers to heck and back, but way too many problems with the setup of that system, especially during online learning days. Boy. But yeah, that's the basics, and my ranting. Sorry if it's a bit unfocused, but that'll be all for now. Happy 4th, have a good day, and see you next time. I hope you enjoyed the video, and celebrate. I know it's the end of the day, but I'm sure you still got plenty of celebrating to do, especially if you're somewhere else. So, have a good one.